a little bit deeper into that. Also, in the Violence Against Women Act, we talked about the culturally specific grant program, but we want to give an overview of that program and how you can apply. We're going to talk about some HUD funds that have been released as of late, as well as the Office of Victims of Crime. So, Umi, I'll let you start with FIPSA and the culturally specific grant program.
Okay, thank you very much. So, FIPSA, Karma, if you don't mind, I had information right in front of me about OVW. So is it okay if I just start there? And then
Yes.
pick up FIPSA? Thank you very much. Appreciate that. So the Office on Violence Against Women was one of the primary ways in which, as we looked and thought about how do we get funding specifically to culturally specific programs, that an office was created called the Office on Violence Against Women. And for culturally specific programs, they weren't getting any of that money. It was very, very difficult for them to have accessibility to those funds. And yet we know that culturally specific programs are best implemented when the people who are implementing the program look like the people that they're serving. And so we wanted to make sure that there were funds available that could go directly to communities. And one of the other things that was thought about as we looked at the Office on Violence Against Women, one of the other things that we thought about was the fact that having to go through the state, being a Black program and going through the state to get your money was also a complication. Many times it was seen that they didn't have accessibility to the leadership on the state level, or that they weren't recognized as having a program that met the qualifications that other domestic violence programs that were already funded under formula grants met. So you may not have had a shelter. You may not have had transitional housing, but you may have, and therefore you may not have been able to comply with all of the rules and regulations for you to have accessibility to money. And so, and knowing that, as we were working to say, we need programs that the community is telling us that we need programs that local organizations, nonprofit organizations, would be able to go directly to the federal government to access those funds. And so that's what was developed. That was what was developed in the Violence Against Women Act, were specific programs, a couple of specific programs where that could happen. And one of those programs is called OVW Grants to Enhance Culturally Specific Services for Victims of Domestic Violence, Dating Violence, Sexual Assault, and Stalking. So you'll note that those same 4 crimes that Karma talked about earlier were the way in which these grants were looked at. And so this particular grant, this past year, as it was administered to the community, had a little bit over $6 million that it was going to release for community funds. The challenge with that was that $6 million was only going to be able to fund 22 programs out of that. And so I know it sounds like a lot of money, but in order to have programs that you're not just saying we're going to give you money for 1 year and that's all you'll be able to get, this was a matter of saying, how do we give more money to communities than just 1 year? So funding and keeping in mind that this may be a 3-year grant. And then out of that $22 million, these 22 programs, out of that $6 million, these 22 programs that are funded would have accessibility to funding for 3 years. And that adds some stability to that program and doing the work. Many times that was the other problem, is that programs were applying for funds and they were getting, $25,000, $75,000, but it was only for 1 year. And therefore it did not sustain the program. How do you hire staff? How do you take care of infrastructure if you don't have some more stability within your funding? And so that's some more background into why the program was created. And so in saying that it was grants to enhance culturally specific services for victims of domestic violence, dating violence, sexual assault, and stalking, the premise here is that only, as we saw it at that time, only racially and ethnically specific programs would be able to apply for this money. And only if they were providing services that were culturally specific. So you may remember that I spoke yesterday a little bit about sometimes you may have a Black program that's doing good work in the community, but the model of how they're doing their work is more reflective of the same thing that the mainstream program is doing. So these funds were not meant to duplicate mainstream program services, but they were meant to say, how do I provide domestic violence, sexual assault, stalking, and dating violence services that recognize that our community has additional needs or other needs? And so how do I take into consideration what those needs are? And then as we develop programming, we're able to include that in the framework. And so applying for the funds, an application comes out for these funds every year. So these programs that were funded for 3 years, they would not be able to apply every year. They would only be able to apply for that coming cycle, and then they couldn't apply next year. And some more programs would be able to apply for 3 years in that next cycle, and so forth. So every year, after 3 years, you would have programs coming off funding and then more programs coming on, because there is this cycle that the program goes through. And some programs are funded for a second cycle or a third cycle, depending on the work that they're doing. It's very competitive. You can't guarantee that you're going to get these funds. And so you have to know that going in. You have to be very astute about how to apply for federal funds. And even before I say how to apply for federal funds, I'm going to take you back to Jennifer. You need to understand how you're going to be the financial conservatory of those funds, because if you're not, then you definitely won't get the funds again. And so you have to really take what Jennifer was telling you to heart. Federal funds are not easy funds to administer. They have a lot of rules, as you saw from Jennifer, and regulations. And so if you apply for the funds, I always advise programs to build in a period of time that they're going to have to organize their organization, to pull together, excuse me, their financial policies and procedures, to review all that information, to make sure you have the infrastructure that can be able to sustain the funds that you're bringing in. So make sure you look at that from the very beginning. It's an application process, a grant application process. Another tip that I like to give to programs is that every grant application will always ask you, who is your target audience and what are the needs of that target audience? And so if you're saying my target audience is the Black community, then you better understand what the needs of the Black community would be. You just can't put down the Black community, but what are the disparities that exist within that community as far as having adequate services that they're providing, as far as those services addressing the realities of their life and how they need to be able to have additional accessibility to information, to resources, to financial areas. You have to really understand what it is your community needs. You might want to do a community assessment, a community listening session where you call in members of the Black community and you listen to them and include Ujima in some of that strategy, because they have a big history in knowing what are some of the types of questions that you want to ask so that you can determine these aspects. And so once you determine what the needs are, then you say, okay, I'm going to write my proposal. You don't write the goals first. You don't write the action steps first. You write the needs first, because your needs will then be compared to what it is you say you're going to do. If you put in a grant proposal that that there aren't enough resources for individuals, financial resources for individuals to have transportation to court, or for them to have repairs on their housing, or whatever you think the specific needs, or culturally specific counseling services that understand the historical traumas that the Black population has been to and how that's impacted violence against women in your community. If you have those things in there, then in your action plan, you're going to have to include strategies that are going to show you how to do that. So this grant program, as I said, is the Office on Violence Against Women Grants to Enhance Culturally Specific Services for Victims of Domestic Violence, Dating Violence, Sexual Assault, and Stalking. And so some of that background will apply to the other programs that I'm going to talk about. Another program is the SAS program. And SAS, unlike the program that we just talked about, only talks about one program, and that's the sexual assault services for culturally specific programs. That program, they only address sexual assault, not the 4 crime areas. And so you can write a grant for the first one, for culturally specific services for the 4 crimes, and you can also write one that's specific for sexual assault services. So maybe you only want to do domestic violence or stalking in one, and then turn around and do your sexual assault in the sexual assault services program application that you submit. Again, that comes out once a year. I think that's only for 2 years. I'm not sure, Carmel, correct? Yes. That grant program is only for 2 years, but it's meant to target sexual assault survivors. And as I said, the same rule applies. You have to be a culturally specific program. You have to belong to one of the racial or ethnic categories, African American or the Black population, I should say. So that can include servicing the African population, that can include servicing the African Caribbean population, as well as the African American population. You could be looking for services that are where you're providing services to the Latino population, the Asian population, and I think I named everybody for those domains. And so the other thing that I want to make you aware of is proving that you are a culturally specific program, because there is that regulation in there that says you have to be a culturally specific program. You cannot be a mainstream program. Then some of the things you may want to do would be to look at your mission statement. How does your mission statement frame the services that you're providing? How has it specifically highlighted that who your clients are that you're serving? So in order to be culturally specific, you can't be a mainstream program that inside your program says we're going to serve the Black population in Detroit. That's not the intention. These are limited funds, and they're meant to go to directly to culturally specific programs. And I think Karma likes to use the phrase, what is it, by us, for us, that we are servicing our own organizations and our own communities. Okay, thank you, Karma. Oh, one more, I'm sorry. One more is the campus program. Almost forgot that. And the campus program is an excellent program also. You won't see it say culturally specific. It's in the Office on Violence Against Women. And when you look it up, it won't say culturally specific programs, but it's for all colleges and universities have an opportunity to apply. You must be a college or a university to apply for those funds. But inside those funds, if you belong to or are at a historical Black college or university, then you can apply for these funds. And you can be very specific and say that those are the funds that you're applying for. And so in that campus program, There are $3.7 million that are being awarded to the community, and they only expect to fund 12 programs. Again, you can see it's a limited number of programs, and that I don't think there's a separation of whether or not it's for historical Black colleges and universities, but that it does have those funds in there. Even if you're not working in a community where there's a historical Black, rather, you're not working at a historical Black college or university, what you want to do is approach them, let them know about the funds, say that how can you partner with them in order for your organization to be able to go in and help to create and craft and deliver the services that they need. Maybe it's something that's happening on campus that they'll be able to do, but maybe you have programs also off-site that you can do, or you can go on campus to help facilitate some of those services. So we want to make sure that you have opportunities to deliver and to have accessibility to your community on all of these different levels. Okay, thanks, Karma.
Thanks, Umi. And since Megan, I believe both Megan and Anna have joined us, and neither one of us were with us at the start of today, so we introduced ourselves, but I think it would be an opportune time. I know, Megan, you did it in the chat, but an opportune time for both Megan and Anna to introduce themselves. One, because Megan is our policy attorney, and because Anna specifically manages our program that provides technical assistance to historically Black colleges and universities.
Yeah, I'll go ahead and introduce myself. Thank you so much, Karma. My name is Anna. My pronouns are she, her, hers, or they, them, theirs. I am the HBCU specialist at Ujima. And like Karma was saying, I am working with the HBCU cohort in the campus grant program with OVW. So I provide technical assistance within the grant work that they're doing, covering the 4 crimes of domestic violence, dating violence, stalking, and sexual assault. So I work with a variety of different HBCUs. That's something that was just recently being talked about. So yeah, and I appreciate being in this space with you all. So thank you.
Thank you, Anna. Megan?
Hi, thanks so much for introducing me. I have been kind of popping in and out and with you guys yesterday as well as today. Like we shared in the chat, and Carmen's been talking with you about me. My name is Megan Simmons. I'm the senior policy attorney here at Ujima. I work on various policies here with the center, as well as varied other things. Thanks so much for your activity in the chat box with me, and just allowing me the opportunity to share space with you this afternoon.
Thanks, Megan. Thanks, Anna. So, Umi, thank you. Did a very thorough job of sort of walking us through on the VAWA side, so on the Violence Against Women Act side, funding streams that are available specifically to culturally specific organizations. I'm going to talk a little bit about in the HHS programming, which specifically our funds come through the Family Violence Prevention Services Office, which implements funding that is allocated through the Family Violence Prevention Services Act, as well as funds that are available through the Department of Justice, but in the Office of Victims of Crime, and then briefly touch on funding through the Department of Housing and Urban Development. So I'm going to start with the Family Violence and Prevention Services Act funds, which the FVPSA office administers right now about $175 million to local domestic violence and community-based domestic violence organizations in the formula as we described. So once it gets to the states, it's provided in a formula where 70% of those dollars go to support shelter funds, 20% go to support outreach and counseling services, and then a portion goes for state domestic violence coalitions, and then a portion of those funds for administration. So you heard that when we initially talked about the implementation of FIPSA. Wanted to just give you a little bit more information of what that looks like on the state. If you visit the HHS website, that www.FIPSA, Family Violence Prevention Services, which is in the Administration of Children and Families, which is included in the chat, you'll find each state's statewide administrator. And it's important, particularly for culturally specific organizations, to reach out to those state administrators, because funding through the states goes through that office, the state administrators that are highlighted on that the Administration of Children and Families page. And they set what their funding deadlines look like. So every 1 to 2 years, FIPSA is actually allocated in 2-year time frames at the federal government. So sometimes at the state, they will either provide each year they do an application, and sometimes it's every other year they do an application. That's all dependent upon how your state allocates at the state level. But those reaching out to those state administrators is important, because that is how you gain access to those FIPSA funds. And again, what we saw this year is, in addition to that $175 million that was allocated for this current fiscal year, there was funds that were allocated through the CARES Act. So there was an additional amount that organizations could access through the CARES Act. And if there is a new COVID package, there will be additional money for FIPSA through HEROES. So anytime that you can reach out to gain access to those funding or to that funding, it's extremely important, because that is what we've seen as one of the more flexible funding streams. And particularly because a lot of our community has said we don't want to have all of our funding and all of our programming focused out of the Department of Justice and focused in the criminal legal system. So while VAWA is expansive, FIPSA is also intentionally focused in the Department of Health and Human Services. It's also, I believe Jacqueline talked about having services for women and girls and focused on prevention. So FIPSA also includes the Delta program, and that is funded out of the Centers for Disease Control. So it's funded out of the CDC, and it's an additional $5.5 million each year. But its role is specifically to fund primary prevention efforts. So coordination happens mostly through statewide domestic violence coalitions. Every state and territory has a statewide domestic violence coalition, as Umi pointed out before. You can find those coalitions at nnedb.org, and I can post that here. We also have them available on our website and through our resource guide. So we can post our website in the chat and send that information out to you all. But you can find your statewide coalition there. And in accessing your statewide coalition, you can ask them about the Delta program. And every state has an opportunity to apply for Delta funds. Very often than not, those Delta programs are coordinated through culturally specific organizations at the state level. So it allows for additional funding for our organizations to focus on primary prevention. So for those of you all who talked about before, really wanting to and digging in and providing programming to young women and girls, that's an opportunity to access some additional funds through the Delta program. The other piece that's important, it's not out of the FIPSA office, but in the Department of Health and Human Services, is the Rape Prevention and Education Program. And that is just over $50 million each year. And that is provided to local health offices, local departments of health, etc., to focus on sexual assault prevention and violence prevention. So very often they will have sexual assault and dating violence prevention programs. And you can also find information about the rape prevention and education program on the CDC's website. But again, that's just over $50 million that goes into local communities and is funded usually out of the Department of Health in your state. So that's HHS programming. Umi, were you about to mention something?
I just wanted to, I found something that I forgot to mention on the funding for the um, campus program, campus grants. I didn't indicate that there's $20 million every year that's allocated for campus grant funding, and that there are 50 awards that approximately 50 awards that are given as well. So again, very worthwhile for us to look at ways in which we can collaborate. The ceiling for those grants, although it's up to $300,000 for individual projects and up to $750,000 for consortium projects, then you can see how it may benefit you to partner together and make sure that everyone is able to get adequate funding in order to provide the services. But that was the only thing. Thanks, Karma.
Thanks, Umi. So any questions about FIPSA or VAWA before we continue? Okay. And we will forward information, links to these grant programs and to both FIPSA and VAWA information, as we have a few fact sheets that we can forward to this group as well. The last two funding streams, the first one is the Victims of Crime Act funds, and those are available through the Department of Justice, the Office of Justice Programs in the U.S. Department of Justice. And VOCA has what's called the State Victim Assistance Grants. And similar to how we said there are state administrators for FIPSA, there are state administrators for the STOP program in VAWA, there are also state administrators for the VOCA grant program. And VOCA is $1.3 billion that is administered through the states. And so that is incredibly important, because that's where we see a lot of culturally specific organizations being able to access funding, because it's not given out in a formula in the same way that you see FIPSA and in the same way that you see some of the VAWA funds. Those funds are available for expansive programs. So domestic violence, sexual assault, for rape prevention, for responding to homicides, for responding to community violence. So we see a lot of gang prevention and gang response programs funded out of VOCA. And I would encourage folks to get to know the VOCA administrators, because we've been doing a lot of conversations with the Office of Victims of Crime as of late, explaining to them that culturally specific organizations have not had access to VOCA funding. And it is an extreme challenge, because when we look at who end up being victims of crime, overwhelmingly it is communities of color, and yet the responses to those victims is not being conducted by and for our communities. And so we really want to see there be greater access to VOCA funds for our communities. One of the challenges that has existed for our communities has been that match. The match on the local level has really sort of been an impediment for a lot of our organizations to gain access for those funds. But you'll remember that through the CARES Act, there was a waiver for VOCA that's implemented this fiscal year, and we're hoping that it will be carried forward so that there can be a waiver for organizations that don't have access to other forms of funding, and then would serve as an additional impediment to those VOCA dollars. I see Erica asked a question: does Ujima provide individual coaching on a step-by-step basis process to ensure your organization is prepared to apply for funding? So we have provided individual technical assistance, where organizations have reached out to receive individualized technical assistance. Our wonderful consultants like Umi are available to do that kind of individual technical assistance, as are some of the folks that you've heard from on the phone. Anna with culturally specific colleges and universities. I know Ayana and Megan Whitney, Sahida, and I have all provided that individual technical assistance. And Jennifer is doing more and more individualized technical assistance with organizations around enhancing their infrastructure to actually be able to apply for this funding. And Erica, as Erica raised that question, I think one of the most important challenges that we've heard from culturally specific organizations around accessing this funding has been the fact that the funds are available on a reimbursement basis. So meaning that, for instance, with FIPSA, with OVW, you have to spend your money first before you have to start the programming before you actually get access to the funding. And that's really important for you to know, because regardless of the funding stream, whether it's VOCA, whether you're talking about VAWA, whether you're talking about FIPSA, the way the government works is that you spend first, they reimburse you later. And we've heard that that is a long-standing impediment for culturally specific organizations. It's something that we've been talking to governmental entities about, and how that provides a challenge for our organizations. But it's government is a bureaucracy, and they want to know that you can stand up the program, and that basically the point is that they don't want our organizations to be reliant upon government funds to run the programs. And so there's probably not going to be a change to that, but more in thinking about this individualized technical assistance, and even the ongoing technical assistance that we provide through Ujima, we're looking at what are some of those other economic options for folks to get access to funding.
And Carmen, I would also like to add about OVC, the Office on Victims of Crime. Another area that you may be interested in applying for would be human trafficking. And there is a substantial allocation of funds in OVC for crime victims regarding trafficking. And the amount has steadily been going up. So in 2016, there was only $42.2 million that was appropriated and available in the community to address those issues. But last year, in 2019, there is $88 million that's available to address those issues. And we know that disproportionately, Black women are treated differently, as they've been identified as a prostitute as opposed to domestic trafficking or human traffic victim. So when we look at this aspect of human trafficking, and we look at the image of how they're saying Black girls present, and we had some conversation with Ayana yesterday even about that, in women and girls who have been incarcerated for retaliating against their pimps, and how they're given long sentences for doing that instead of being provided services for being a victim of crime. And so, and some of that money also comes out of HHS. So there's a human trafficking appropriation, as an example, for last year of $85 million, but then HHS transferred to OVC another $3 million, as they had done for the past 4 years, to bring that up to a total of $88 million that's available right for last funding cycle. Karma?
Thanks, Umi. Thank you for that. I would, to that end, there's also out of the Department of Health and Human Services has trafficking grants. So if you're interested in additional funds for trafficking, the Department of Health and Human Services has trafficking grant, as does the Department of Transportation. The Department of Transportation has funding for trafficking, because there's recognition that very often in places where, you know, bus stops and others, places where there is an attachment to transportation, is where you often see trafficking occurring at higher numbers. And so the Department of Transportation put funding in FY17 and has continued that funding for trafficking response. So lastly, you know, OVC and VOCA, and again, I want to make sure that folks aren't trying to furiously write. We're going to provide this information at another time. We just wanted to provide an opportunity for you to just hear about some of these grant programs. But lastly, we want to talk about HUD and the Department of Housing and Urban Development and those grant funds, because HUD has just over $3 billion available for homelessness prevention funding. And in fiscal year 2018, HUD provided or made a priority a response to domestic violence and sexual assault throughout their programming. And so what does that mean for us as culturally specific organizations? It means that there's a lot of funding on the table through HUD at the state level through what is called their local continuums of care. And you can find those, and I'll put that in the chat momentarily. But you can find the local continuums of care at hudexchange.info. And it's really important to gain access to those continuums of care, because that funding at the federal government level goes through the state through those continuums of care. And gaining access to that funds allows you access to things like the emergency services grants, the community development block grants. It allows funds to access to and funds to gain access to some of the homelessness prevention services dollars. It allows funds and gains access to Section 8 vouchers. All of those programs come through HUD and are allocated on a local level through those continuums of care. They have a lot of power, and what we know from our advocacy is very often they say they don't hear from communities of color, even though we are overrepresented in the homelessness system. And one of our advocacy points with HUD has always been that our organizations don't necessarily have the capacity to sit in all of these various places. So thinking about partnerships where possible is another important thing to do with HUD. And during one of our earlier regional meetings, I wish that April, the folks from HUD could be here with us, but they were out of the office. And so they have committed to sending us information that we can send to you all. But one of the important other things with HUD is that through the CARES Act, HUD received an additional $2.96 billion. So almost an additional $3 billion on top of the existing $3 billion they had to give out at the state level. They received another $3 billion. And those grants hit the streets in the last 2 weeks and are still available. So we're encouraging people to try to access the HUD website and access your local continuums of care, because they are rolling that money out and looking to get the money out as soon as possible through those continuums of care. And I think one of the things that April said during our last conversation is, where possible, if you can have an idea developed for how you might use homelessness services funds with your population, whatever population that you're serving, to write that up and present that to your continuum of care, so that they're not having to think through how will we spend this money, but that you can already come with a proposal that they might be ready to fund, because they have to get the money out as quickly as possible. So if you will put that up there, I would also suggest on the HUD Exchange, they have their FY18 fiscal, so that's fiscal year 18, fiscal year 17, and HUD provides funding in multiple years. So those are the latest fiscal year applications that they have up. In that fiscal year, they have those applications, or what they call NOFAs, and a NOFA is a notification of funding. They have those NOFAs up, and anytime that you can pull that out and start to think about the kind of programming that you want to develop in drafting based on what the NOFA looks like, it's also a great opportunity, because fiscal years start for the federal government October 1 through September 30th. So folks are trying to decide right now how to begin to allocate funding for the next fiscal year. We in Washington, D.C. just submitted a number of our state grants. You're going to be submitting, some state grants are already available. Culturally specific grants are coming out from OVW in the next couple of months. And those grants, the previous RFPs are available on the OVW's website. I would just encourage everyone, if you're thinking about any of these funding opportunities, to look at those existing RFPs or funding NOFAs, as HUD calls them, so that you can get a head start on developing your grant program.
And they don't change very much. And so that's why it's a really good suggestion that Karma is making, that you take the opportunity to look them up and see what types of things they funded under the last grant cycle. And, you know, it seems like it takes forever for the next application request to come out. But once it comes out, the time goes so quickly, you may not have an opportunity to do the thorough research and community assessing that you need to do before it needs to be submitted. And so with OVW, you can look for those applications anytime after October. November, usually they come out a little bit later. They come out later in the year, but now we're finding that they're coming out around December. You may start to see them late November, December. You may start to see them come out, because it's a cycle that it has to go through. Even though it comes out as it will in 2020, those grant applications will come out in about December of 2020, but they'll be due in January, February of 2021, and then they have to go through a review process. So submitting the grant is not just the final step, it's one step. After you get the grant submitted to your federal funders, then they convene a grant review committee. And this review committee sits down and reads all of these grants that have been submitted. And they have a standard that they go by. And in your application, it'll tell you, you get 15 points for this, you get 5 points for this, you get 10 points for this, etc. So look at that and know those heavily weighted components. It doesn't mean that any component should be less than your very best in giving them the information, but it definitely will show what they're giving the most attention to, because the grant reviewers will rate you on that scale. If you had 10 points that's available and you left out half the information, you may get 5 points, you may get 3 points, depending on how adequate the information is. And as you're filling out the application, answer every question. I don't care if it's in that section. Answer if it's a question that OVW posed, if it's a direction that they've given you. Just make sure there's a line, there's some information that responds to it, because these grant reviewers are not necessarily from communities of color, and specifically not necessarily from the Black community. And they, while you may know what you're trying to say, they may not be able to clearly see what you're trying to say. And they'll say, nope, you didn't use that key word here or there, and grade you down on your applications. These applications are very competitive, and so you do want to start now. Start now. Your organization is functioning. Are you a culturally specific organization? Do you meet the qualifications? How have you represented yourself? What does your website look like? I've been in grant review sessions, and people have said culturally specific, and somebody will pull up the grant website and it'll just be all beautiful white children and women that are on the website. And they say, nope, that's not what we're looking for. So does your website correspond with your mission? Are you using social media in a way of getting to your community? What are the best ways to reach your community? And are you addressing the needs of the community in a culturally specific way? So start now in assessing those needs for your community, and then having those conversations with these national resource centers that exist in order for you to make sure you're doing a job that's going to rate you. And then in a good favor. And the last thing I want to say is, we're placing so much emphasis on this because Black programs have not been getting funded, okay? So we're putting a lot of emphasis on this because even within culturally specific dollars, it's been difficult for us to get Black programs funded. So we need you to be clear on what they're asking. Get assistance. and find out how to get your application reviewed before you submit it, so that you're giving the best application you can, and we can get the resources that we need in the Black community.
Absolutely. To Umi's point, in the Office on Violence Against Women culturally specific grant program, less than 10% of those grantees are Black programs. So because of that, even though the authors primarily were African American, even though the intent was for these programs to go to all communities of color, when we actually saw the grants go out the door, less than 10% of those grants were going to our communities. And we heard things like our communities didn't write grants well. We heard things like our communities didn't have the infrastructure to manage the money. We heard things like our communities don't know how to talk about culturally specific services. So our communities were saying they were culturally specific simply because there was a person of color leading the organization, but their programming was not culturally specific. And so again, that's why these conversations are very important, and reaching out to some of the national technical assistance providers are very important, because when we see the actual funding going out the door, our organizations are not gaining access to them. I'd also say, it feels overwhelming to write an application. It feels, you spend hours and days and you're not sure that you're going to gain access to the funding. But what we have all seen through grant review is even when the organization is not funded, it lifts up the name of that organization to the grant, to the actual grant funder. So for instance, even though the Office on Violence Against Women, if you're applying to them and you don't get that funding, they know the name of your organization for the next time. And we've seen that work wonders for organizations. They've gone out and done site visits with organizations that might not be funded, but lifting up those organizations or lifting up your organization is incredibly important. Also, there is no better practice for actually getting a grant than writing one of these grants. And I say to folks all the time, it's important to have that experience. I'd also say that both the Department of Justice and the Department of Health and Human Services regularly send out information and emails for grant reviewers. If you have not become or have never been a grant reviewer, it's a great opportunity to experience or at least get some insight on what the funders are looking for in their grants. It also provides you with an opportunity to access language, to figure out whether or not your program makes sense, because once you actually receive the funding, you can't review for that specific grant program. So it's really important, and they pay for you to review. That's the other piece, is that they do provide funding for grant reviewers. And so all of these things, are opportunities for, if you're not immediately gaining access to the funds, there are opportunities for you to develop some readiness, to develop the capacity to actually access the dollars. Because, I'm sorry, go ahead, Umi.
No, I was gonna say, just because you don't get funded one year, then doesn't mean that you won't get funded the next year. And if you don't get funding, what you need to do is to request your grant review notes. You need to ask the funder for your grant review notes so that you can get that information and see why was it that your application did not get the maximum amount of points that it could have gotten in that particular section.
Absolutely. So as we said, we know it's a lot of information, and Ujima is here. You've got our website. You also have the contact information for various of our team members. We hope that you will take the opportunity to reach out to us with any questions. We are sending out on a regular basis updates around policies. Also, when there are grant opportunities, forwarding that information. I would also encourage you to connect with Whitney, as Whitney has been coordinating not just our listening sessions, but has been keeping a coordinated list of all of the resources in our community, which means those culturally specific organizations that are serving our community. So it will be important for you to become one of to be listed in that resource guide, because we send information based on that resource guide, but we also provide that resource guide to community-based organizations, to survivors who are looking for resources. And it's often that other entities, governmental and non-governmental, ask for that resource list so they have a sense of who are those culturally specific providers that you are talking about all the time. Where can we find them? Because if we want to send information to them, what we hear from states and what we hear from funders is that they don't know who we are. And so we need to have your information, have your contact information. So when they ask in Illinois, who are those culturally specific organizations, we can readily point to them. And that has been increasingly important that we've heard from state administrators, because very often when they're saying we can't get this money out the door, they're saying they can't get it out the door because they don't know who to give it to. So I would encourage you to also reach out to Whitney as well.
I'm so glad that you mentioned that, Karma, because you should also be looking up the websites and information on culturally specific organizations. And really, even if you go to the funder, to OVW or to FIPSA or to HUD or if you go to any of those websites, it will tell you who they funded in that past year, who got the money from them. And you would be able to then say, what are they doing, these culturally specific organizations, that we are not doing? How does their programming look different than our programming? And then that way you can begin to make sure that your program is specific to your community and not just a duplication of a mainstream program that's providing services to everyone.
Thank you, Umi. So, with that, we want to leave some time for if there are any additional questions, to make sure that there is time and space for you to ask those questions. We've been trying to follow the chat. And so I think we've addressed most of the questions that have come up in the chat. Whitney has just posted the information for connecting with our staff members. So you can email us at ujimaiinfo@ujimacommunity.org. Please do that if you'd like to be included on any of these lists, or if you would like to request training or technical assistance, or if you just want to connect with a particular staff member, you can do so through accessing that or emailing us at the Ujima Info email address that Whitney posted in the chat. So any questions, any additional feedback, any additional things that folks want to bring up related to funding streams, access to funding, grants, policy?
And please remember that Ujima has regular podcasts and webinars that they post. This is another way for you to be able to see and get language about how do we talk about culturally specific services in the Black community. And so you want to make sure that you're on that list and register for all of those webinars and podcasts as they're presented.
As we are about to wrap up, because we appreciate that everyone has been sitting still and paying attention to us for the past, day and a half, and really have appreciated all of your wonderful comments, all of the feedback, all of the information that you've shared. And I believe that it was Jacqueline who said this morning and yesterday the importance of the bravery that everyone has come to the table with, and your ability to not just speak from your community's perspective, but speaking from your individual perspectives and being honest and open with us. And so we certainly appreciate that. We know that, one of the things that we say through Ujima is that, we are all surviving something. And that we have all experienced some form of trauma. So we acknowledge and lift that up as well, that, you know, when we're talking about survivors, we're not talking about the them, we are talking about the us, the collective us. And so we appreciate you taking the time out of your days to be with us for the last day and a half. And with that, I want to make sure that, and she doesn't know that I'm going to do this, but Whitney, to close us out, because Umi just did talk about the podcasts and webinars. So Whitney, if you could just give everyone an overview of the podcast series that you've been leading and the webinars, and then with that, we'll close out.
Hey everyone. So the podcast series was not necessarily a series. We have, they usually come out once a month or every other month. And the name of the podcast is Collectively Speaking. So the name comes from Ujima, which is in collective work. So basically we cover everything from Black maternal health to obviously violence against women, anything dealing with domestic violence, anything dealing with community violence as well is big. We've covered mental health on several occasions. We've covered Black love and what that looks like in Black community. And then most recently we did a pre and post COVID show around what the education system will look like for marginalized communities, specifically Black students as they are working virtually, and what that will look like if the school year extends out virtually or in person. So it was a really in-depth conversation around how Black kids are being left behind, basically, during this time. And it was really interesting speaking to an actual educator around what we need to do in order to make sure that our Black and brown kids are getting everything that they need in order to keep up with the system. Because once they return to school, she was saying that the problem is how do we evaluate the students, you know, and figure out what they need when one kid has access to a computer and internet and the other one doesn't. So, and if we extend out the virtual, what are some other resources that we need to give to our communities that may not have access to all these resources? So I think the podcast also gives us an opportunity to speak to those topics that we may not be able to in a webinar or in a more formal setting. So if you all are interested in checking that out, it's on our website. Our webinars as well are coming up on our website as well. And we cover a plethora of topics for our webinar. And one that you all were able to see here was Umi's on the first day around being unapologetically Black. And that was a huge hit. The first time we did it, we got a lot of hits from it. So that's up there. And then there are a couple others. So if there's something you don't see that we've done in the past and you want to know more about it, we just recently did one around allyship. Megan teamed up with the South Carolina Bar to do that. And that was a great informative panel around allyship that is posted up as well. So you can also go to our YouTube page and view all of these. And last but not least, we have Coffee and Conversations as well, and Ayana has definitely taken the lead on that. Coffee and Conversation is kind of like another side of the podcast as well, where we can talk about those topics in an intimate setting around how Black women are affected socially. Again, we covered domestic violence. We covered Black love during February for Black Love Day. So we do a lot, and there are more topics coming out. So I hope you guys go to the website, take a look at some of our material. If there's something you don't see, please email us, because we have a catalog of a lot of things that just have not gone up yet. And hopefully they will be there before the fiscal year is out.
Thank you, Megan, and thank you to everyone for joining us for the regional meeting. Again, we look forward to connecting with you all in some of the